July 27, 1944. Morning light lay thin and pale over the Norman countryside near Saint-de-Lagaste, France. Low hedgerows cut the fields into narrow compartments, limiting vision, compressing movement, and forcing armored warfare into brutal short-range encounters where seconds mattered more than doctrine. Somewhere behind the tree line, an American armored column was edging forward, engines throttled low, crews straining to see through dust, smoke, and shattered foliage. From a concealed firing position, a Panther tank of the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, waited in silence. Its engine idled, the turret already aligned toward a gap in the hedgerow where American tanks had been advancing one by one. The Panther's gunner watched through his sight, calm, methodical, operating on assumptions forged by 2 years of uninterrupted success. He had done this before, many times, in Russia, in Tunisia, in Italy. He knew exactly what would happen next. The moment came with mechanical precision. The Panther's 88mm round left the barrel with a violent concussion, tearing through the hedgerow and striking the approaching Sherman squarely in the hull. Steel screamed as the projectile punched through armor plate, sending a spray of incandescent fragments into the fighting compartment. For the German crew, the sequence was already complete. Penetration meant destruction. Destruction meant fire. Fire meant death. The gunner did not cheer. He did not shout. He simply recorded the result in his mind. Target destroyed. The driver advanced the Panther forward 20 meters, adjusting position for a second engagement. The loader was already reaching for another round. Everything unfolded according to training manuals memorized in gunnery schools from Putlos to Paderborn. The Panther crew had no doubt they were witnessing the final moments of another American tank crew. But something was wrong. There was no eruption of flame, no plume of black smoke, no secondary explosion tearing the turret from its ring. The Sherman did not become a burning wreck. Instead, it moved. The American tank's turret began to traverse, slow at first, then with purpose, swinging toward the Panther's position. The long barrel of its 76mm gun aligned with lethal intent. Inside the German tank, the loader froze, his hands suspended mid-motion. The gunner leaned closer to his optics, uncertain whether he was seeing correctly. That Sherman should have been dead. Every German assumption said it must be dead. Every intelligence report said so. Every battlefield lesson since 1942 reinforced the same conclusion. Once a Sherman was penetrated, it burned. That belief was not superstition. It was empirical, documented, calculated. German tank crews had learned to rely on it as a tactical certainty. Yet here, in the fields of Normandy, the certainty failed. What the Panther crew had just encountered was not luck, nor an anomaly, nor an unusually brave American crew refusing to abandon a doomed machine. They had fired upon a different kind of Sherman, one that German intelligence did not know existed. The tank they struck was an M4A3-76 Sherman, equipped with a wet-stowage ammunition system. It looked no different from the thousands of Shermans German forces believed they understood completely. Its silhouette was familiar. Its armor thickness unchanged, its tactical employment identical. Nothing about its exterior signaled danger or deception. The revolution was hidden inside. Beneath the turret basket, below the crew's feet, the tank's ammunition was no longer stacked in open racks along the sponsons, where a single penetration could ignite propellant charges instantly. Instead, the rounds were sealed inside double-walled steel containers mounted in the hull floor, surrounded by liquid designed to smother flame and absorb heat. 38 gallons of suppressant solution encased the ammunition, transforming what had once been a fatal vulnerability into a controlled risk. For German gunners, this change was invisible. For American crews, it was the difference between incineration and survival. By July 1944, this modification had already reshaped the battlefield. Every Sherman produced after January of that year incorporated wet stowage as standard. Tests conducted before the tanks ever reached Europe demonstrated the impact with brutal clarity. Where earlier Shermans burned after penetration in 60 to 80% of cases, wet stowage reduced that figure to between 10 and 15%. Penetration no longer equaled annihilation. On the morning near Sandilagast, the 2nd Armored Division was attacking with 104 Shermans incorporating this system. German units opposing them had received no warning. Not a single intelligence briefing mentioned the change. No captured document hinted at it. No frontline rumor reached divisional headquarters. As far as German doctrine was concerned, the Sherman remained exactly what it had been in Tunisia. That assumption had been forged in catastrophe. February 14th, 1943, Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. American armored units, newly arrived and inadequately prepared, advanced into terrain dominated by experienced German forces. The result was a disaster. Of approximately 300 American tanks committed, 183 were destroyed. Many did not simply stop functioning, they burned. Ammunition fires consumed entire crews within seconds, turning steel hulls into crematoriums. British operational research teams documented the carnage meticulously. 65% of knocked-out Shermans burned completely. American after-action studies produced even grimmer numbers, with some engagements showing ammunition fires in up to 80% of penetrations. For German forces, the lesson was clear and reinforcing. The Sherman was not just inferior, it was fatally flawed. German technical intelligence seized on this vulnerability with characteristic thoroughness. Captured M4A1 tanks from North Africa were shipped to proving grounds, disassembled, measured, and diagrammed. Analysts noted the placement of ammunition in sponsons above track level, directly behind thin side armor. Gunnery manuals were updated. Training films emphasized aiming points. Range cards issued to anti-tank units highlighted these areas in red ink. German tank crews were taught not merely how to defeat the Sherman, but how to destroy it utterly. This doctrine became embedded across the Panzer Force. From Tiger commanders to anti-tank gunners armed with towed 75mm guns, the expectation remained consistent. Hit the sponson, ignite the ammunition, eliminate the crew. It was not optimism. It was operational logic supported by hundreds of burning wrecks. What German intelligence did not see was the response unfolding across the Atlantic. The American Ordnance Department, confronted with the North African losses, initiated a comprehensive investigation. Every knocked-out Sherman was examined. Metallurgists, chemists, engineers, and frontline officers contributed data. The conclusion overturned popular assumptions. Gasoline was not the primary cause of catastrophic fires. Ammunition propellant was. More than 70 rounds were carried inside each tank, stored in open racks throughout the fighting compartment. When penetrated by hot steel fragments, those propellant charges ignited instantly, spreading flame faster than crews could react. The solution did not require thicker armor or a new tank. It required rethinking where ammunition lived and how it behaved under fire. The transformation that followed was rapid, pragmatic, and almost entirely invisible to the enemy. By November 1943, design meetings were exploring unconventional ideas. Surround the ammunition with liquid. Drown fire before it could spread. Early proposals bordered on absurd, filling entire compartments with water, creating submarine-like interiors. But iteration refined the concept into something elegant and manufacturable. Double-walled steel bins, liquid-filled cavities, hull floor placement away from likely impact points. By January 3, 1944, the first wet stowage Shermans rolled off American assembly lines. None of this registered in German intelligence channels. Their assessments remained anchored to captured vehicles from early 1943. Intelligence bulletins distributed to frontline units referenced those evaluations as definitive. Reports from Normandy describing Shermans that survived penetrations were dismissed as exaggerations, misidentifications, or mechanical anomalies. Doctrine does not change easily, especially when it has worked. Back near Sandilagast, the Panther crew did not know they were witnessing the collapse of a belief system. They knew only that the expected outcome had failed to materialize. The Sherman they had struck was alive. It was fighting back. Moments later, the American tank fired. The round struck near the Panther's mantlet, forcing the German crew to withdraw under pressure they had not anticipated. What should have been a clean kill had become a contested engagement. Somewhere behind the Sherman's armor, liquid seeped through ruptured compartments, soaking propellant that might otherwise have turned the tank into a funeral pyre. The Panther crew survived that engagement. Many others would not. Across Normandy, German defensive calculations based on permanent Sherman losses began to unravel. Tanks thought destroyed reappeared within days. Units expected to be depleted continued advancing. Counterattacks met resistance stronger than anticipated. The error was subtle, cumulative, and devastating. German forces were fighting an enemy they believed they understood completely. They were wrong. For German armored forces in 1944, the belief that the American Sherman tank burned easily was not a rumor passed along the front. It was a systematized conviction, sustained by doctrine, reinforced by training, and validated, so it seemed, by years of combat experience. It was embedded so deeply in Panzer thinking that it shaped not only how German crews fought, but how German intelligence interpreted every report coming back from the battlefield. This belief rested on three pillars: technical intelligence, combat doctrine, and institutional memory. The first pillar was technical certainty. German armored intelligence had studied the Sherman in extraordinary detail, but at a specific moment in time. The vehicles captured in North Africa during the winter and spring of 1943 became the definitive reference for the American tank. These were M4A1 and M4A2 variants, produced in 1942 and early 1943, all of them fitted with dry ammunition stowage. German engineers at proving grounds such as Kummersdorf and Hillersleben disassembled them methodically. Armor plate composition was measured. Welding techniques were evaluated. Engines were run under load. Transmission systems were stripped and analyzed. Nothing was left unexamined. The ammunition layout, in particular, attracted intense attention. German analysts quickly identified what they considered the Sherman's fatal flaw: the placement of main gun rounds in open racks along the sponsons, above the track line, directly behind relatively thin side armor. To a German engineer, this was an invitation. Any penetrating hit in this area would shower the fighting compartment with superheated fragments, igniting exposed propellant charges almost instantly. This observation was not speculative. It matched battlefield results with brutal consistency. German technical reports quantified the vulnerability. Penetrations into the sponson area were judged to have an exceptionally high probability of catastrophic fire. The conclusions were circulated widely. Diagrams showing ammunition placement were reproduced and distributed to panzer units. Gunnery manuals incorporated these findings into standard instruction. Anti-tank crews were taught not merely to hit a Sherman, but where to hit it. The result was a form of technical dogma. The Sherman was not simply inferior, it was predictable. Its destruction followed a known sequence: penetrate the hull or turret, ignite the ammunition, eliminate the crew, permanent kill. The second pillar sustaining this belief was doctrine. German armored warfare emphasized decisive firepower and rapid destruction of enemy armor. The Panzerwaffe had been shaped by early war successes where superior gunnery, crew training, and tactical coordination produced quick, irreversible outcomes. Tanks were not expected to survive multiple penetrations. They were either operational or destroyed. The Sherman, with its reputation for burning once hit, fit neatly into this framework. Training reinforced this expectation relentlessly. German gunnery schools from Putlos on the Baltic coast to Paderborn in Westphalia drilled crews using range cards that marked Sherman weak points in bold, unmistakable terms. Sponson shots were highlighted. Turret side hits were emphasized. Instructors cited North Africa, citing percentages, recounting after-action reports, where American tanks burned so fiercely that crews had no chance to escape. By the time German units reached Normandy in 1944, many gunners had internalized this logic to the point of reflex. They did not wait to confirm destruction. A penetrating hit was enough. The mental checklist ended there. The third pillar was institutional memory. German armored forces had been fighting continuously since 1939. Veterans of Poland, France, the Balkans, Russia, and North Africa carried forward lessons learned in earlier campaigns. When those lessons appeared to repeat themselves, they hardened into assumptions. In Tunisia, German crews had watched Sherman after Sherman erupt in flame. At Kasserine Pass, American tanks burned so consistently that the phenomenon seemed almost inherent to the design. British and American losses were studied by German officers who concluded that the Sherman's vulnerability was structural, not situational. It was not a flaw that could be corrected quickly, or at all, within the constraints of wartime production. This assumption was reinforced by German views of American engineering culture. German officers tended to believe that the United States prioritized mass production over refinement, quantity over quality. The Sherman, in their minds, was a product of this philosophy: easy to build, easy to deploy, and easy to destroy. They expected the Americans to respond to battlefield losses by producing more tanks, not better ones. This expectation proved fatal. What German intelligence failed to account for was the American approach to incremental improvement. While German tank development increasingly pursued radical solutions, heavier armor, larger guns, more complex designs, the Americans focused on solving specific, clearly defined problems as quickly as possible, even if the solution was inelegant or unglamorous. The ammunition fire problem was exactly such a case. American investigators after Tunisia did not ask how to make the Sherman invulnerable. They asked how to stop it from killing its own crew after penetration. The distinction mattered. Armor thickness could not be increased significantly without slowing production or overloading suspension systems. New tanks would take years. But ammunition stowage could be redesigned within months. The American Ordnance Department's Tank Automotive Center analyzed dozens of knocked-out vehicles, tracing fire patterns and fragment paths. Their findings were unambiguous. In most cases, the initial penetration did not kill the crew. The fire that followed did. Hot fragments ignited exposed propellant, and the resulting chain reaction turned the fighting compartment into an inferno within seconds. The solution did not require revolutionary thinking. It required containment. Engineers explored ways to isolate ammunition from the fighting compartment and to suppress ignition if fragments penetrated storage bins. A chemical engineer from DuPont, attending a tank board meeting in late 1943, proposed surrounding ammunition with liquid. The idea initially seemed impractical. Tanks were not ships. Space was limited. Weight mattered. Liquids froze. They corroded metal. But American design culture encouraged experimentation. Prototype systems were developed quickly. Double-walled steel containers were designed, with cavities between the walls filled with liquid. If a projectile or fragment penetrated the bin, the liquid would escape, flooding the compartment around the damaged round, soaking propellant and suppressing flame before it could spread. The system evolved through testing. Water alone proved inadequate in cold conditions. Ethylene glycol prevented freezing, but introduced corrosion problems. Eventually, a specialized mixture known as Amudamp, containing ethyl sodium potassium phosphate, along with corrosion inhibitors and biocides, solved these issues. It remained liquid at extreme cold, did not corrode brass casings, and suppressed fire more effectively than water. By December 1943, the concept had matured enough for production. Here, the difference between American and German industrial systems became decisive. American factories did not stop production to redesign the tank from scratch. They modified the production line while it continued running. Hull floors were redesigned to accept ammunition bins below the turret basket. Assembly jigs were altered, welding sequences were adjusted, turret baskets were partially removed to allow access to floor storage. None of these changes altered the tank's external appearance in a way that German reconnaissance could detect. The result was a silent transformation. By January 1944, wet-stowage Shermans were leaving factories in Pennsylvania and Michigan in increasing numbers. By June, American factories were producing only wet-stowage variants. The changeover was so smooth that even Allied frontline units were not always aware of its significance. To most American tankers, it was simply another modification, noted briefly in training but not celebrated. German intelligence, meanwhile, remained anchored to its earlier conclusions. Captured Shermans examined by German technicians during 1944 were often older vehicles lost during early fighting or disabled in ways that prevented detailed inspection. Frontline units that encountered Sherman's surviving penetrations reported confusion rather than insight. Crews assumed they had missed ammunition or that the hit had struck an empty rack. Staff officers, relying on authoritative technical reports from 1943, dismissed these accounts as battlefield misinterpretations. Organizational dysfunction compounded the problem. German technical intelligence was divided among multiple agencies with overlapping responsibilities and poor coordination. Field reports rarely reached analysts in time to influence doctrine. Resources were increasingly scarce. Captured vehicles were often pressed directly into service rather than sent to proving grounds. Even when intact Shermans fell into German hands late in the war, the internal changes were not recognized as revolutionary. Most critically, the wet-stowage system did not demand new tactics from American crews. Shermans fought the same way they always had. They advanced, fired, withdrew, and maneuvered according to established doctrine. There were no dramatic changes to signal that something fundamental had shifted. No new silhouette, no new weapon, no visible armor increase. The modification was invisible to an enemy trained to look for visible change. Thus, by the summer of 1944, German armored forces entered Normandy fighting a tank they believed they understood completely. Their gunnery doctrine, tactical planning, and attrition models all rested on the assumption that penetrating hits would reliably produce permanent kills. That assumption would soon collapse under pressure. As Operation Cobra unfolded and American armored divisions began breaking out of the Norman hedgerows, German forces discovered that their mathematics no longer worked. Tanks counted as destroyed returned to action. Units expected to be exhausted continued attacking. Defensive plans based on predicted American losses failed repeatedly. Yet even then, the system sustaining the old belief resisted correction. Doctrine, once embedded, does not yield easily. German crews continued aiming for sponsons. Training manuals were not rewritten. Intelligence summaries referenced outdated data. The Panzerwaffe fought on, confident in conclusions that no longer matched reality. They were not ignorant. They were trapped by their own certainty. The system that had sustained German success in earlier years, thorough analysis, disciplined doctrine, reliance on proven experience, had become a liability. It prevented recognition of a subtle but decisive change. The Americans had not replaced the Sherman. They had quietly removed its deadliest flaw. And German forces, unaware of this transformation, would pay the price in steel, fuel, and lives as the campaign moved from the hedgerows of Normandy toward the German frontier. The belief that the Sherman tank burned easily did not collapse all at once. It fractured slowly, under pressure, through a series of warnings that German forces either misunderstood or ignored. These early signs appeared long before Normandy, long before Operation Cobra, and long before German crews found themselves staring in disbelief at American tanks that refused to die. The first fracture came not from German intelligence, but from American failure. February 1943 had exposed the Sherman's weakness with brutal clarity. At Kasserine Pass, American armored units were thrown into combat without sufficient coordination, experience, or preparation. German forces exploited every mistake. The results were devastating. Penetrating hits ignited ammunition with horrifying consistency. Entire crews were lost in seconds. Tanks burned so completely that recovery was impossible. The battlefield itself seemed to confirm German assumptions. But for American analysts, Kasserine was not proof of inevitability. It was evidence of a solvable problem. In the weeks following the fighting, American recovery teams scoured the wreckage fields of Tunisia. Burned hulls were examined piece by piece. Investigators traced flame patterns, noting where fires originated and how rapidly they spread. They measured fragment trajectories and cataloged the locations of penetrations relative to ammunition storage. What emerged contradicted popular belief among frontline troops. Gasoline was rarely the initiating factor. Despite widespread myths, fuel tanks were generally well isolated. They did not explode on impact. Instead, fires almost always began where propellant charges were exposed. The Sherman carried more than 70 main gun rounds, stored throughout the fighting compartment in open racks. When a shell penetrated the armor, fragments turned those propellant bags into kindling. Fire spread faster than crews could react. This finding reframed the problem entirely. If ammunition was the cause, then ammunition could be protected. The tank did not need to become invulnerable. It needed to stop killing its own crew after penetration. That distinction allowed American engineers to move quickly, unconstrained by the need to design a new vehicle. By mid-1943, experimental solutions were already underway. Early attempts were crude. Some prototypes simply relocated ammunition lower in the hull, reducing exposure but not eliminating the risk. Others experimented with partial shielding. None produced the dramatic reduction in fires that investigators sought. The breakthrough came when engineers stopped trying to prevent penetration and focused instead on controlling what happened afterward. The concept of wet stowage emerged from this shift in thinking. If propellant ignited because it was dry and exposed, then it could be surrounded with liquid that would absorb heat and smother flame. The idea was simple in principle, but complex in execution. Tanks were not designed to carry large volumes of liquid inside the fighting compartment. Space was limited. Weight mattered. Environmental conditions ranged from desert heat to European winter cold. Initial proposals bordered on impractical. Some suggested flooding entire compartments. Others imagined fully sealed ammunition chambers resembling pressure vessels. These ideas were rejected quickly. They were too heavy, too complex, or impossible to implement at scale. What survived was a compromise: localized containment. Engineers designed double-walled steel ammunition bins, each cell holding a limited number of rounds. The gap between the walls would be filled with liquid. If a fragment penetrated the bin, the liquid would escape immediately, flooding the damaged area and soaking any exposed propellant. Fire would be suppressed before it could spread to adjacent rounds. Testing began in the autumn of 1943. At Aberdeen Proving Ground, technicians fired captured German 75mm and 88mm guns at ammunition stowage mock-ups. The results were unmistakable. Dry storage ignited in the majority of penetrations. Wet storage did not. In controlled conditions, dry ammunition burned catastrophically in nearly 3/4 of hits. Wet stowage reduced that figure to a small fraction. Film footage of these tests was classified. When eventually released decades later, the contrast was stark. Dry storage erupted into towering flames. Wet storage produced brief flashes or puffs of smoke that extinguished themselves almost immediately. The chemistry mattered as much as the concept. Water alone proved inadequate. In cold weather, it froze. Frozen liquid could not flow to suppress fire. It also encouraged corrosion, degrading brass cartridge cases and steel containers. Ethylene glycol solved the freezing problem but introduced new issues, accelerating corrosion and creating maintenance headaches. The final solution was a specialized compound known as amidamp. Its formulation balanced fire suppression, corrosion resistance, and low-temperature performance. It remained liquid at extreme cold, inhibited rust, prevented bacterial growth, and absorbed heat efficiently. It was not glamorous, but it worked. By late 1943, the system was ready for production. Here, the speed of American industrial adaptation became decisive. Factories did not pause output to redesign the Sherman from scratch. They modified the vehicle while it continued to roll off assembly lines. Hull floors were re-engineered to accept ammunition bins below the turret basket. This required new stamping dies, altered welding fixtures, and revised assembly sequences. Turret baskets were partially removed to allow access to floor storage, forcing changes to traverse mechanisms and internal cabling. None of this altered the tank's outward appearance. The modification added weight, nearly half a ton, but the Sherman's suspension absorbed it without major penalty. Mobility remained acceptable. Reliability was unchanged. To the outside observer, the tank was the same machine German intelligence believed it understood. By January 1944, wet-stowage Shermans were entering service. By spring, they were arriving in Britain in growing numbers. Training delays and ammunition logistics initially kept them from the beaches on D-Day, but by July they were ready. The first cracks in German assumptions appeared almost immediately. During early fighting in Normandy, German units began reporting anomalies. Panthers and anti-tank guns achieved penetrations at favorable ranges, yet the expected fires did not always follow. Some Shermans withdrew under their own power. Others continued fighting. German gunners assumed these were near misses, empty racks, or engine compartment hits that failed to ignite ammunition. Staff officers discounted the reports. German intelligence structures were ill-suited to recognize subtle change. Technical evaluations were based on captured vehicles from early 1943. Intelligence bulletins continued to circulate diagrams of sponson-mounted ammunition racks that no longer existed in new production tanks. Frontline observations that contradicted established doctrine were treated as stress-induced misinterpretation. Organizational fragmentation made matters worse. Multiple intelligence agencies competed for authority. Field reports moved slowly. Captured equipment was often reused immediately rather than analyzed. As the war situation deteriorated, analytical capacity shrank. Priority shifted to immediate survival rather than long-term assessment. Even when intact wet-stowage Shermans were captured later in the war, their significance was missed. The ammunition bins did not announce themselves. Liquid-filled cavities were not obvious without detailed inspection. German crews operating captured vehicles often did so without understanding why they behaved differently under fire. Thus, the fractures remained unrecognized as fractures. German forces continued to fight, based on models that assumed permanent destruction rates no longer applied. Attrition calculations overestimated American losses. Defensive plans assumed enemy units would be weakened after engagements that, in reality, left many Shermans repairable. Counterattacks were launched against formations expected to be depleted, only to encounter unexpected resistance. By the time German commanders began to suspect that something fundamental had changed, the opportunity to respond had passed. The Sherman had not become invincible. It still could be penetrated. Crews still died, tanks still burned, but the probability of catastrophic loss had dropped dramatically. What had once been a near certainty was now an exception. This quiet shift did not produce dramatic battlefield moments. It produced something far more dangerous for the defender: resilience. American armored units absorbed punishment and kept moving. Losses that would have halted operations in 1943 no longer did so in 1944. The fractures in German assumptions widened with every engagement. What remained was pressure, sustained, grinding, mathematical pressure that would soon cause the entire system to fail. The collapse did not announce itself with a single catastrophic defeat. It unfolded through arithmetic, through the steady accumulation of small survivals that German doctrine had never accounted for. What broke the system was not that Shermans could no longer be destroyed, but that they were no longer being destroyed permanently. Operation Cobra began on July 25, 1944, at 09:38 hours, with the heaviest concentration of tactical air power ever employed in direct support of ground forces. Thousands of bombers shattered a narrow sector of the German front west of St. Lo. When the dust settled, American armored divisions surged forward through gaps that German planners believed could be sealed quickly by counterattack. Among the leading formations were the 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions, both equipped with the first wet-stowage Shermans to see large-scale combat in Europe. German units opposing them were already under strain. The bombing had disorganized command structures, disrupted communications, and destroyed many prepared defensive positions. What remained was expected to delay the American advance long enough for reserves to respond. That expectation rested on a familiar calculation. American tanks would suffer heavy losses during the breakout, thinning spearheads and buying time. The Panthers and anti-tank guns waiting in ambush positions were confident of their role. At the tactical level, German gunners did their job. They achieved penetrations at ranges and angles that doctrine deemed optimal. Panthers struck Shermans in hulls and turrets. Anti-tank guns fired from concealed positions along hedgerows and road junctions. By every metric German crews used to evaluate success, the engagements went according to plan, but the outcomes did not. Shermans that should have burned did not always do so. Tanks struck in the fighting compartment were disabled, but crews escaped. Vehicles withdrew under their own power. Others were abandoned intact, later recovered. German after-action reports captured when headquarters were overrun reveal growing confusion. Units reported high numbers of penetrations without corresponding numbers of burning wrecks. From the German perspective, this was deeply unsettling. Panzer crews were trained to assess battlefield results visually. A burning tank was a confirmed kill. A tank without fire was ambiguous. In the chaos of combat, ambiguity translated into false certainty. Many Shermans counted as destroyed were, in reality, recoverable. American maintenance units exploited this gap relentlessly. Behind the advancing spearheads, recovery teams moved forward almost immediately. Tanks disabled by penetrations but spared ammunition, fires could be repaired quickly, engines replaced, tracks rebuilt, electrical systems rewired. In many cases, a Sherman knocked out in the morning returned to action within 48 hours. This was not a minor effect. It was multiplicative. German defensive plans assumed that penetrating hits translated directly into permanent losses. Attrition models calculated how many tanks American units would lose during an engagement and how long it would take to replace them. These models now failed catastrophically. The Americans were losing tanks, but not losing strength at the expected rate. Counterattacks launched on the assumption of weakened American spearheads ran headlong into intact armored formations. This effect became more pronounced as the breakout widened. The Norman bocage forced close-range fighting, exactly the environment where German guns excelled. Panthers routinely penetrated Sherman armor at these distances, yet the expected thinning of American units did not occur. Instead, German units found themselves facing repeated assaults by formations they believed had already been attrited. The mathematics no longer worked. The scale of the failure became unmistakable during the subsequent advance across France. Third Army's maintenance battalions reported recovering and repairing approximately two-thirds of knocked-out Shermans during Operation Cobra. In earlier campaigns, the majority of those vehicles would have been total losses, consumed by fire. Now they represented temporary setbacks. What this meant in operational terms was devastating for German planners. A tank battalion that might have lost 18 to 24 vehicles to fire after 30 penetrations in 1943 now lost only 3 to 5. The remainder could be salvaged. The battalion retained combat effectiveness instead of requiring withdrawal and reconstitution. Multiply this effect across divisions, and the result was an American armored force that seemed inexhaustible. German commanders noticed, but misinterpreted. War diaries and post-war interrogations reveal frustration rather than understanding. Commanders complained that American tanks appeared in greater numbers than expected, that reserves seemed limitless, that units thought destroyed reappeared inexplicably. Few connected these observations to a specific technical cause. The assumption that Sherman vulnerability was fixed remained unchallenged. The failure to recognize the cause mattered because it shaped the German response. Rather than adapting tactics or reassessing intelligence, German units doubled down on existing doctrine. Gunners continued aiming for sponsons. Anti-tank units sought better angles, closer ranges, heavier weapons. The solution, they believed, lay in more firepower, not in questioning the underlying model. This approach reached its breaking point during the German counteroffensive at Mortain in early August 1944. Operation Lüttich was launched on August 7th with 4 panzer divisions, aimed at cutting off American spearheads and restoring the front. The plan assumed American armored units were depleted after their rapid advance. German intelligence estimated American tank strength at roughly 60% of actual numbers, failing to account for recovered vehicles returned to service. The result was predictable. American units, supported by tanks that should have been destroyed, absorbed the counterattack and shattered it. Infantry divisions, reinforced by tank battalions equipped with wet-stowage Shermans, held under pressure that German planners believed would overwhelm them. The same pattern repeated in subsequent engagements. At Aricourt in September 1944, the disconnect between German expectation and reality became impossible to ignore. German armored units achieved numerous penetrations against Shermans of the 4th Armored Division. By traditional metrics, American losses should have crippled the division. Instead, it continued offensive operations. The statistics told the story with brutal clarity. During the fighting, the 4th Armored Division suffered 151 Sherman losses. Of those, only 41 were total write-offs. The remaining 110 were repaired and returned to service, most within a week. German intelligence counted all 151 as permanent losses and concluded that the division should have been combat ineffective. It was not. American armored units did not merely survive. They maintained momentum. They advanced when German planners expected them to halt. They counterattacked when German doctrine predicted exhaustion. The invisible advantage compounded day after day, engagement after engagement. From the German perspective, the battlefield had become irrational. Penetration no longer guaranteed elimination. Attrition no longer produced expected results. Operational pauses did not occur when models predicted they must. The German system of planning, built on accurate assessment of enemy losses, was undermined by a single modification it did not know existed. By autumn 1944, this collapse under pressure was systemic. German forces were reacting to American strength that appeared to defy logic, while American engineers and maintenance crews quietly ensured that damaged tanks returned to the line again and again. The wet-stowage system had not changed how Shermans fought. It changed how long they could fight. And that difference, measured not in tactics but in percentages, was enough to break the German understanding of the battlefield. By the autumn of 1944, The evidence was no longer subtle. American armored formations were absorbing punishment at a rate that contradicted every German model of mechanized warfare. Penetrations were being achieved. Hits were being recorded. Yet the battlefield outcomes refused to align with expectation. The question was no longer whether something had changed, but whether anyone on the German side still possessed the capacity to recognize what it was. On the American side, recognition had come earlier, and adaptation had already been institutionalized. Within U.S. armored units, wet stowage was not treated as a revolutionary breakthrough. It was considered a practical correction, one of dozens of incremental improvements introduced since 1942. Crews were informed of its presence, taught basic inspection procedures, and instructed to check liquid levels through access ports during maintenance. Beyond that, there was little ceremony. American tankers were pragmatic. If it kept them alive, it was accepted. What mattered was not how dramatic the improvement felt, but how it changed operational behavior. American commanders began to notice that tank losses no longer translated into immediate operational paralysis. Units could remain engaged longer. Recovery operations could be conducted closer to the front. Maintenance battalions adapted their workflows, prioritizing rapid battlefield recovery rather than rear area replacement. Tanks disabled by penetration were no longer written off reflexively. They were assessed, repaired, and returned. This altered command confidence. General officers who had once viewed the Sherman as expendable began to trust it as a resilient system. Initial skepticism toward the 76mm gun, particularly concerns about ammunition supply and training, gave way as the combination of improved firepower and enhanced survivability proved itself in combat. After the battles of late summer and early autumn 1944, American armored doctrine shifted decisively. By October, Third Army and First Army were requesting only wet stowage variants. Dry stowage Shermans were increasingly relegated to secondary roles or withdrawn. The change was not ideological, it was statistical. The next phase of adaptation came through further refinement. The M4A3E8, later known as the Easy 8, incorporated lessons learned during the Normandy breakout and subsequent advances. Wider tracks improved mobility under increased weight. The horizontal volute spring suspension provided a smoother ride and better cross-country performance. Ammunition stowage was further refined for accessibility without compromising protection. These tanks began reaching frontline units in October 1944. In parallel, a specialized variant embodied the survivability philosophy more explicitly. The M4A3E2, known as the Jumbo, entered production in mid-1944 with wet stowage integrated from the outset. Its frontal armor approached 4 inches. The turret face reached 6. It was not fast. It was not elegant. It was designed to absorb punishment. By November, First Army fielded over 100 jumbos across multiple battalions. Third Army had nearly 90. These tanks were used as spearheads against fortified positions, drawing fire that would have annihilated earlier Shermans. Combined with protected ammunition, their survival rates bordered on the astonishing. German observers noticed the effect, but misread the cause. Captured reports and post-war memoirs reflect confusion rather than insight. German crews described American tanks that would not burn, vehicles that continued to fight after penetration, formations that reappeared after destruction. These observations were recorded, but not synthesized. No doctrinal revision followed. No systematic investigation was launched. By late 1944, German technical intelligence was in collapse. The agencies responsible for equipment analysis were understaffed, under-resourced, and increasingly irrelevant. Priority shifted to so-called wonder weapons that promised salvation through dramatic technological leaps. Incremental enemy improvements did not attract attention. Even when intact wet stowage Shermans were captured during operations such as Nordwind in January 1945, their significance went unnoticed. German crews sometimes operated these captured tanks for days without understanding why they behaved differently under fire. The institutional pathways that might have recognized the change no longer functioned. Field reports rarely reached analysts. Analysts lacked authority to influence doctrine. Doctrine no longer guided practice. The system had become reactive, fragmented, and rigid at precisely the moment when adaptability mattered most. The contrast with American practice could not have been sharper. American industry continued to iterate even as combat intensified. Factories incorporated changes without halting production. Maintenance units adjusted procedures in real time. Operational research teams gathered data from the field, analyzed it, and fed conclusions back into design and training loops. The wet-stowage system itself was monitored continuously, with performance data confirming its effectiveness beyond initial projections. This feedback loop mattered because it amplified the original advantage. By the time of the Ardennes offensive in December 1944, the wet-stowage effect was fully integrated into American armored operations. German planning for the offensive assumed American tank losses would follow 1943 patterns. They did not. Panthers achieved penetrations at close range, yet American resistance persisted. Tanks disabled in one engagement returned days later. Units thought weakened retained cohesion. German commanders expressed frustration in post-war interrogations. They described fighting an enemy whose material losses did not produce expected operational results. They spoke of American abundance, but failed to identify the specific mechanism that preserved American strength under fire. The wet-stowage system had achieved something rare in warfare. It had altered the outcome of engagements without altering their appearance. It did not announce itself through new silhouettes or dramatic battlefield behavior. It simply removed a catastrophic failure mode from the equation. And because German forces never recognized this removal, they continued fighting as if the failure mode still existed. By early 1945, American armored units had adapted fully to this new reality. German forces had not. Recognition and adaptation, the twin pillars of effective military learning, were asymmetrically distributed. The Americans adapted quietly and continuously. The Germans recognized only that something was wrong, and too late to correct it. The final consequences of this imbalance would be felt not in individual battles, but across the strategic collapse of German resistance in the West. By the final winter of the war in Western Europe, the effects of the wet-stowage modification had accumulated into something far larger than its designers ever intended. What began as a technical response to a specific battlefield problem had become a structural advantage, one that shaped campaigns, distorted enemy planning, and accelerated the collapse of German resistance, without ever revealing itself as the cause. The Ardennes offensive, launched on December 16, 1944, was the last and most desperate German attempt to reverse the strategic situation in the West. Its planning rested on assumptions drawn directly from experience in 1943. German staff officers calculated American armored losses using models that assumed penetrating hits would reliably produce permanent destruction. Concentrated panzer attacks, they believed, would shatter American tank units piecemeal, opening corridors for exploitation before Allied reserves could respond. Those calculations were wrong. In the forests and villages of Belgium, Panthers and Panzer IVs achieved close-range penetrations against Shermans at rates German crews considered ideal. Yet American resistance did not collapse. Units absorbed damage and remained operational. Tanks disabled one day returned the next. German spearheads stalled, not because they failed to hit American armor, but because those hits no longer translated into irreversible loss. The failure was not tactical, it was mathematical. German operational planning depended on attrition producing predictable effects. When those effects failed to materialize, the entire logic of the offensive unraveled. Units advanced expecting weakened opposition and encountered intact formations instead. Fuel allocations, already precarious, were consumed faster than anticipated as engagements dragged on longer than planned. Timetables slipped, momentum vanished. At the tactical level, the same pattern repeated again and again. In battalion after battalion, American tanks absorbed penetrations that would have been fatal a year earlier. The 743rd Tank Battalion, engaged repeatedly during the Ardennes fighting, suffered numerous penetrations, yet maintained cohesion throughout days of combat. Hits that once meant annihilation now meant damage, often severe, sometimes fatal, but increasingly survivable. For American crews, the change was existential. The wet-stowage system did not guarantee survival. It offered probability. It shifted the odds. Tanks still burned, crews still died, but far fewer did so instantly and without chance of escape. Thousands of tankers lived through hits that would have killed them in earlier models. Those survivors mattered, not just morally, but operationally. Trained crews returned to duty, experience accumulated rather than being erased. By early 1945, German forces were encountering wet-stowage Shermans routinely, from the Vosges to the Rhine. Some were captured intact. Others were recovered and briefly operated by German units desperate for serviceable vehicles. Yet even then, recognition did not come. The ammunition bins were not dramatic. The liquid-filled cavities were not obvious. Without a functioning intelligence apparatus to analyze and disseminate findings, the opportunity passed unnoticed. Postwar studies would later quantify what German commanders never understood in time. American operations research documented that pre-modification Shermans burned in 60 to 80% of penetrating hits. Wet-stowage variants burned in only 10 to 15%. The implications were profound. In a typical engagement where a battalion suffered 30 penetrating hits, earlier Shermans would have lost 18 to 24 tanks permanently. With wet-stowage, only 3 to 5 burned. The remainder could be repaired. This difference did not merely preserve vehicles, it preserved tempo. Battalions that would once have required withdrawal and reconstitution remained in action. Divisions maintained momentum across successive engagements. Campaign plans based on continuous pressure became viable because armored strength did not evaporate under fire. Across the European theater, conservative estimates suggest that the modification prevented catastrophic fires in at least 1,000 tanks, saving roughly 5,000 crew members and preserving dozens of armored units from combat ineffectiveness. German planning never incorporated this reality. Every major operational plan from Normandy to the Rhine relied on obsolete data about Sherman vulnerability. Attrition estimates were inflated. Reserve calculations were flawed. Counterattacks were mistimed. Defensive lines were under-resourced. The same systematic error repeated across thousands of engagements, compounding until defeat became inevitable. The intelligence failure was nearly total. Post-war memoirs and interrogations confirm it by omission. German tank aces who wrote extensively about combat against Shermans never mentioned unusual resistance to fire. Unit histories compiled privately after the war contain no recognition of the change. These were not censored documents. They were recollections among comrades. The absence speaks louder than any admission. Multiple factors contributed to the blind spot. German technical evaluations were frozen in time, based on vehicles captured before the modification existed. Organizational fragmentation prevented frontline observations from shaping analysis. Resource scarcity redirected attention toward desperate technological gambles rather than enemy equipment study. Cultural overconfidence reduced perceived need for continuous reassessment. Most critically, the modification did not announce itself. Wet-stowage did not change how the Sherman looked, how it moved, or how it fought. It did not demand new tactics. It did not require special training visible to the enemy. It altered only what happened after penetration, and only in probability. German intelligence, trained to detect dramatic changes, missed a quiet one. The strategic consequences were cumulative and irreversible. American armored forces entered 1945 with strength levels German planners believed impossible. The crossing of the Rhine, the encirclement of the Ruhr, and the rapid advance into central Germany were all shaped by sustained armored momentum. Tanks that should have been burning wrecks continued rolling east. Crews that should have died continued fighting. The wet-stowage system did not win the war by itself. It did something more subtle and more decisive. It removed a predictable failure mode from American operations, while leaving the enemy unaware that anything had changed. American engineers designed the system to save lives, not to deceive. Yet its invisibility multiplied its effect beyond calculation. German forces fought the wrong enemy, an enemy defined by assumptions that no longer applied. They aimed for weaknesses that had been quietly erased. In the end, the modification exemplified a broader truth about industrial warfare. Victory does not always belong to the most dramatic innovation or the most formidable machine. Sometimes it belongs to the solution implemented quickly, everywhere, and without ceremony. A solution that works silently, accumulates invisibly, and breaks the enemy not through shock, but through sustained resilience. The Sherman's wet-stowage ammunition system changed the arithmetic of armored warfare. By doing so, it shortened the war, preserved American combat power, and saved thousands of lives, while remaining almost entirely unseen by the enemy it helped defeat.